President, please be seated. The court is back in session, and I now hand over the floor to the International Deputy Co-Prosecutor to put questions for this civil party. You may now proceed. Please wait, International Deputy Co-Prosecutor. You may now proceed, Mr. Sun Visal, Counsel Sun Visal. Mr. President, Your Honors, before the International Deputy Co-Prosecutor proceeds to put more questions to the civil party, as you may be aware that this civil party received a protective measure. Before the break, the witness said the counsel. The witness responded to the question by the Deputy International Co-Prosecutor that the civil party is not concerned about his security or safety. If it is so, why does the court or the chamber grants the protective measure for the civil party? I am of the opinion that the protective measure should be lifted, and we should not grant protective measure for this civil party. This is my only observation. President, is it an observation or is it a request? If it is a request, you should provide reasons for your request. Observation is different from a request. Counsel, this is my observation and also my request. If the civil party is not concerned of the security or his safety, and then we should not grant a protective measure. President, your request is overruled. I object this because you have not submitted any reasons for your request. And we received a request for protective measure through lead co-lawyers, and the chamber discussed with the West Sioux on the matter, and the chamber issued a decision already on the request. If you want to put a request before the chamber, you should have provided a clear reason. You are not allowed to raise this matter again. You may now proceed, International Deputy Co-Prosecutor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We were, at the break, we were discussing your father and his imprisonment at Office 204. My last question on this subject, did you ever learn subsequent, after your father was released, at any time, who the chief of Office 204 was?
Answer, in the period, I did not know the leaders. I did not know who the leaders were, and I do not know the composition of 204.
I'm going to turn now to the period where you were sent to Damreel Mountain and then to work at Krang Tachan. In interview E319.1.23 at answer 56, you stated that you were part of a 6-man military unit that also included Sim, Son, and a person named Surat, who in answer 69 you then identified as small or little Deutsch. Two of these people, Van Sohn, and little Deutsch, known as Srey Tan, have already testified in this trial, and they have both confirmed that they were part of that six-man unit with you. Van Sohn, also on the 5th of March this year, E1 272.1 at 10:44:44 to 10:45:32, testified that you and he were cousins. Can you confirm whether you and Van Sohn were cousins, and also whether you were in the same military unit as your cousin Sohn, Sim, and little Deutsch, both before you came to Krang Tachan and while you were working at the prison?
Answer. As for Wan Swan is my relative. Wan Swan mother and my father is a sibling. Actually, we met each other at a Krang Tachan security office.
Let me follow up to clarify. With regard to either Van Sohn, Sim, or little Deutsch, were you in the same unit as any of those people before going to Krang Tachan?
Answer. After we transfer into Krang Tachan, we were in different units. We were in different 50-member units, but we were in the same division.
Let me follow up a little more. In your OCIJ statement E319.1.23, at answer number 19, you described how prior to being sent to Krang Tachan, quote, I was assigned to prepare the arrest of Prum San, who had been accused of betraying the revolution on Panum Damri Romial Mountain, Tramcock District, end of quote. And today you testified that your unit was stationed at Damri Romial with the assignment to arrest Prum San in 1975. In his trial testimony on the 3rd of March 2015, this is E1/270.1 at 14:23:27 through 14:27:11. Your cousin, Van Sohn, also described how he was sent to Damri Romial to arrest Prum San before his unit was assigned to Krang Tachan. My question for you, does this refresh your recollection that you and your cousin Van Sohn were both sent to Damri Romial to try to arrest Prum San, and after that were sent to Krang Tachan?
Answer. That is true.
Your cousin, Van Soen, also testified to this court on that same day, the 3rd of March, 2015. This reference is E1/270.1 at 14:33:36, that the two of you, along with Sim and Little Deutsch, all were sent to Krang Tachan at the same time. Does that refresh your recollection that you, Soen, Sim, and Little Deutsch all started working at Krang Tachan at the same time?
Answer, yes, that is true.
Van Soen also testified on that same day at 14:10:18 that he began to work at Krang Tachan in late 1975. The other members of the unit, Sim, testified in his OCIJ interview D40/20 in the very first question that he was sent to Krang Tachan during the rice harvest in 1976. And in his testimony in this trial on the 19th of February of this year, E1/266.1 at 11:02:54, Little Deutsch admitted that he was transferred to Krang Tachan in late 1976. Does this refresh your recollection, Mr. Civil Party, that you, Soen, Sim, and Little Deutsch all started working at Krang Tachan in either late 1975 or 1976, and not in 1977, as you testified earlier today?
Answer, I was transferred to the office in 1976. I did not know whether it was in late 1976 or early 1976.
Thank you for clarifying that. I want to ask you about another statement you made in your interview E319.1.23, and this is at question and answer numbers 48 to 49. You testified that you had a god-grandfather named Tachem, who was longtime friends with Krang Tachan prison chief On, and that you saw Tachem come to visit Ta On at the prison. And in answer 51, you gave the following testimony. Question: was it because of the good friendship between Ta On and Tachem that you were appointed head of security guards at Krang Tachan? Answer: yes, that was the reason I was appointed head of the prison guards. End of quote. First, I'd like you to tell me a little bit about your god-grandfather Tachem. Where was he from, and what did he do?
Answer, in colonial period, my parents, when they were evacuated from their area to live in Toteng Tngai, my parents lived with Tachem. Actually, Tachem was not our relative, and we were all evacuated from the west of National Road number 3 to live in the east of National Road number 3. We were evacuated because there was afraid that danger would happen on us.
And what did Tachem do? What was his occupation, or if he was in the revolution, what was his position in the Khmer Rouge?
Answer. Tajem had no position. He was an ordinary citizen. He was the former teacher in Lon Nol period, and he said that he was the friend of Ta An.
You indicated that you and your family lived with Tachem after you were evacuated from your village. When was it that you were evacuated from your village and your family lived with Tachem?
It was in 1971 or 1972.
Thank you. In that same interview at answer 67, you gave the following testimony, and this is E319.1.23. Question, did the guards carry guns? Answer, yes, they did. End of quote. Can you tell us what type of gun did the guards at Krang Tachan carry?
Answer. As for the gun which I carried, it was M16 and CKC.
Now, I want to ask you a few questions. You testified in response to questions earlier identifying the leaders of Krang Tachan, including Ta An. In interview E319.1.23 at answer 53, you testified in response to the question, who supervised the guards? Your answer was Ta An himself. And in answers 104 to 106 of that same interview, you described self-criticism and life view meetings that were led by Ta An, at which he warned you about escaping and, quote, instructed us to be responsible for the prisoners and prevent their escape, end of quote. My first question is, can you tell us where these self-criticism or life view meetings were held?
Answer. Live view meeting to re-educate those who committed wrongs were held in the dining hall.
And who all participated in those meetings?
Answer. In the dining hall, there were combatants, people from the units.
So these were meetings for the combatants or cadres who worked at Krang Tachan. Is that correct?
Answer. The leaders of the security told us that the soldiers would care of their duty, and as for the cadres, they were told of their different duties.
How often did Prison Chief On conduct meetings like this?
Answer. It was not too often. The meeting would held once a month, or sometimes there was no meeting at all in a month.
And you've talked about the instructions you received at this meeting and the commitment you had to make regarding prisoners not escaping. Can you remember and tell us a little bit about other subjects that were discussed at these meetings led by Ta'an?
Answer. In the meeting or meetings, combatants were instructed to be in charge of their duty. If the prisoner could be able to escape, their life would end.
I realize it was a long time ago. Do you remember anything else that On talked about at these meetings other than that?
Answer. Beside this subject, it seems that there were no other subjects. Actually, there was the discussion that the combatants and the people there has to find and search for food to eat in the security office by themselves.
Earlier today, you testified that it was special units in the communes or district who went to arrest the prisoners and bring them to Krang Tachan. I want to ask you a few questions about what happened when these prisoners arrived at Krang Tachan. In your civil party application, and this is document D22/88 at Khmer 00354-365, English 00379-421, and French 0105-5820. You made the following statement in that application, quote, "Once I rang the bell calling those who were in the office to take prisoners back into the prison, and I also followed them," end of quote. And in a document that's been admitted in this case, E3/2120 at English 00416-390. This is a book only available, this excerpt is only available in English right now. This is a book that was written by a researcher named Meng Tri Yi, who states that he interviewed you, Sot Sang, in October 2001, and he attributed the following statement to you and another guard. I quote, former cadres Chanta and Sang reported that its prisoner escorts rang a bell that hung from a mango tree just west of the center. Upon hearing the bell, the cadres came out to meet the prisoners and led them to cells inside. End of quote. My first question for you, was there a bell outside the Krang Tachan compound that was rung when prisoners were brought to the entrance of the compound?
Answer. The bell was at the outside compound of the Krang Tachan security office. There were two levels of fence, and the bell was at the outside compound.
Just to clarify, do you mean that the bell was outside the outer fence as opposed to the inner fence?
Answer. Yes, it was in the outer fence.
The second excerpt I just read to you was a statement attributed to you by a researcher named Meng Tri E, who interviewed you in 2001. Do you remember being interviewed in 2001 by a person who was writing a book or doing research?
Answer. I did not remember the content of the interview. There were many interviews. Many researchers went to interview me, and I did not recall all those people.
Let me ask you now, turn to the subject of the types of prisoners at Krang Tachan. Can you tell us what types of prisoners were sent to the Krang Tachan security office?
Answer. I did not know about the type of prisoners. The units in villages, commune, district, and in the country, I saw prisoners were brought from those areas to the security office.
Let me refresh your recollection with two statements that you provided to the investigating judges. First, in interview E 319.1.23 at answer 91, you stated, quote, "There was a mixture of prisoners. They were arrested on accusations they had been against the revolution," end of quote. And in your interview D40/21 at Khmer 00165-342, English 00223-551, and French 00524-330, you testified as follows. Question: what offenses had the prisoners held there committed? Answer: some had connections to officials of previous times. Some had deserted the ranks. Some had been sexually immoral. My first question, what did you mean by prisoners who had connections to officials of previous times?
During the revolutionary period, they were against the previous regimes. It is my understanding that if you were accused of betraying the revolution, then you will be sent for re-education, and it means that you will be smashed.
And when you talk about the previous regime, are you referring to the Lon Nol regime?
It included the lunar regime, and up to the time that the revolutionary regime took over.
Did the prisoners at Krang Tachan include former Lon Nol soldiers or officials or people who were relatives or otherwise connected to former Lon Nol people?
Yes.
Now, in the book of Meng Tri Yi that I read an excerpt to you earlier, who interviewed you in October 2001, this is E3 2120 at English 00416-383. And just to advise the court, we've requested a translation of there is a chapter in this book that relates to district re-education offices and has substantial information regarding Krang Tachan. So we've made a request that that entire chapter, which is about 30 pages, be translated. In any event, the site, current site, English 416383. The following statement is attributed to you, Mr. Civil Party. Quote, Sut Sang took custody of former Lon Nol soldiers and policemen arrested by the Sub-District Committee and sent to the Tram Kok Re-Education Center. He explained that in mid-1975, a terrible number of prisoners were brought in day and night, night and day. There was no sleep, end of quote. And Mr. Civil Party, in this trial on the 4th of February, Sai Sen testified as follows. This is at E1 256.1 at 14:36:30 to 14:38:17. Quote, the number of prisoners increased after the country was liberated. That is, after they liberated Phnom Penh. Those former Lon Nol soldiers were regarded as prisoners of war, and Phnom Penh people were considered 17 April people, and they were taken there, end of quote. My question to you, what can you tell the court about the arrests of former Lon Nol soldiers and policemen in Tram Kok District in 1975?
At that time, I was not aware of that as I was with the army.
Did you subsequently become aware that large numbers of Lon Nol soldiers had been arrested following liberation, following the 17th of April, 1975?
I did not know where the former Lon Nol soldiers who were arrested were sent to. It happened before I went to work at the Krang Tachan.
What did you hear or observe regarding the arrests of former Lon Nol soldiers?
At that time, I was a soldier in the army, so I did not know what's going on at the rear.
I understand that you cannot read, so I will not, I have a document that I want to ask you about. Instead, Mr. President, I will simply read the references for the witness. This is document E3/4164, and it is a Krang Tachan prisoner list entitled Brief Biographies of Prisoners at Tram Kak District Education Office. And my first question to you, Mr. Civil Party, the second and third prisoners on this list were two female medics that had been sent to Krang Tachan, a woman named Han, her full name was Uch Han, and a woman named Vorn Saroon. Do you remember two female medic prisoners at Krang Tachan named Han and Saroon, who may have also been referred to as Roon?
As for Han and Run, I knew them. President interrupts. I think there is a technical issue. Court officer, please check it. Civil party responses. At Krang Tachan, An and Run were there.
And do you remember how long Han and Roon were detained at Krang Tachan?
I did not know the details because after I returned to the army, I did not know whether she returned to reunite with her family in the village.
This prisoner list includes the prisoner's former position or occupation, and whether they were 17 April people or base people. Of the 29 prisoners on this list, 21 are identified as 17 April people and 6 as base people. In addition, 11 of the prisoners are identified as former Lon Nol military, and another as the son of a smashed Lon Nol captain. My question for you, Mr. Civil Party, based on your observations as a guard at Krang Tachan, were there more prisoners who were 17 April people or more who were base people?
President witness, please wait. And Council Coupe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Two objections. It's a leading question, but most questions are leading questions. But more importantly, this witness couldn't possibly say if somebody is a 17 April person or not. I mean, it's not tattooed on their forehead. So he cannot read, and the only way that you can actually determine if somebody is a 17 April people is probably by reading. But certainly this witness is not able to determine whether somebody is a 17 April person, yes or no.
And Mr. President, if I may respond, the question wasn't leading. It asked him for his observation. Second, there are other ways, of course, that a guard who worked at Krang Tachan could have information on this, observations, having learned where people were from, where they came from, or such matters. So I think as a person who worked at Krang Tachan, this is a perfectly proper question for him to answer.
President, the objection raised by the defense counsel is overruled, and the chamber needs to hear the response from the witness to the question put to him by the prosecution. Mr. Civil Party, please respond to the last question put to you by the prosecution, and as the Civil Party worked there, then he might know about what was being put to him by the prosecution. And please respond to the question if you can recall, Mr. Civil Party. Civil Party. Amongst the prisoners there, I had no idea who were the former Lon Nol soldiers or who were the best or 17 April people.
Thank you, Mr. Civil Party. Let me turn now to the question of the number of prisoners who were at Krang Tachan. You provided some testimony this morning about arrival of prisoners and how many prisoners would arrive on given days. Also in your interview D40/21 at Khmer 00165-340, English 00223-550, French 00524-328. You were asked how many prisoners were usually at Krang Tachan, and your response was, quote, sometimes 20, sometimes 30, end of quote. Now, I want to read to you some of the statements of your fellow unit members who have given evidence. Your fellow guard Sim testified as follows in D40/20, year-end reference Khmer 00165-333, English 00433-572, French 00524-321. Question: in general, how many prisoners were sent in at a time and how often? Answer: sometimes 10, sometimes 5, sometimes 1, almost every single day. End of quote. Sim also testified at the same year-end that there were 3 buildings for detention and that each building had 2 rows with 20 people in each row. Little Dooch, Sratan, has testified in this court on the 19th of February 2015, reference E1 266.1 at 11:12:48 to 11:16:49. He testified that the number of prisoners brought in to Krang Tachan varied from 3 or 4 up to 20 prisoners per day, that there were 2 detention buildings, and that each building could hold about 50 to 60 prisoners. And your cousin, Van Son, acknowledged in his testimony to this court on the 4th of March 2015, reference E1 271.1 at 9:25:10 to 9:27:22, Son stated that, quote, prisoners were sent in almost on a daily basis, end of quote, and that each building could accommodate at least 50 prisoners. Now, Mr. Civil Party, you also acknowledged in your OCIJ interview that it was hard for you to estimate the number of prisoners because, and I quote, you never counted them. Is it possible that your estimate of the number of prisoners at Krang Tachan is low and that the number of prisoners there was higher and more consistent with the evidence we heard from the other 3 guards?
I cannot say whether the number was less or more, as I did not take a count of all the prisoners. I focus on my assignments, that is to go and find food, to go fishing at various cooperatives and sometimes far from the center.
Can you give us your testimony on how many buildings there were where prisoners were detained and how many prisoners each building could hold?
In the Krang Tachan Security Center, there were 3 buildings. 2 were situated to the east and 1 was to the west of the center. As for the number of prisoners, not all buildings were fully loaded with them.
When the buildings were fully occupied, how many people could they hold?
I am not sure as the total number a building could accommodate. However, I can say that each building could accommodate 2 rows of a prisoner, and there was a footpath in between.
I'm going to read to you from another document that's been admitted in this trial. It is document E3/2109. E3/2109. The ERN are Khmer 00068-014, English 00276-555, and French 00290-272. Mr. Civil Party, this document is a report from Krang Tachan for the month of November 1977. Mr. President, with your leave, may I display this on the screen?
For what reason, Mr. President? I mean, he can't read.
This is a public proceeding. It's for the benefit of the bench and for the members of the public.
President, there is no translation into Khmer. Court officer, could you check? President, the Deputy Co-Prosecutor, could you please repeat your last question since there was no translation?
Was there a translation of the ERN, or do I need to repeat the whole question? I understand from my colleague, but what wasn't translated was my response to counsel, Mr. Koppe. My response to him was that the displaying on the screen is not just for the benefit of the civil party or witness, it's for the benefit of the court and the public. So that's the reason for the request to display the document on the screen.
President, the chamber allows it.
Mr. Civil Party, this document reported that during the month of November 1977, 75 new prisoners had entered, 92 prisoners were purged, 6 died of illness, and 1, a lieutenant colonel, had been removed to sector by Ankar, leaving a total of 85 prisoners as of the end of that month. This report tells us then that there were 109 prisoners at Krang Tachan at the start of November 1977. Over the course of that month, 75 new prisoners arrived, 99 were purged, died, or transferred, leaving a total of 85 at the end of the month. Does that refresh your recollection that as of late 1977, there were typically around 100 prisoners at Krang Tachan at any given time?
I cannot recall the number or the year, as it has been far too long. It's more than 30 years now.
This report also has a reference to a lieutenant colonel having been removed to sector by Ankar. Do you have any information? Were you aware of prisoners at Krang Tachan ever being sent to the sector?
No, I was not aware of that. I was not aware of anyone being sent to the sector level.
You testified this morning that prisoners were not provided medicine and not allowed to clean themselves. I want to read to you another statement that was attributed to you in the book of Meng Tri E, E3/2120 at English 00416-390, and I quote, so the document number again, E3/2120, and available in English only, 416390.
President, the Deputy Co-Prosecutor, please repeat the EN number again.
Let me repeat the full site. It's document E3/2120 at English ERN 00416-390. And I quote, Sang, a Tramkak cadre, explained the causes of death of sick prisoners as, quote, most importantly, weakness from lack of food and medical attention. If a prisoner died during the night, the Khmer Rouge cadres did not take the body away immediately. They left the corpse until dawn or the next afternoon, when the light offenders returned from work and could carry it away for burial. End of quote. Mr. Civil Party, can you tell us how often did prisoners get sick at Krang Tachan, and was any medical treatment ever provided to them?
Prisoners who were detained there, from what I could see, did not receive any medical treatment.
And did you have any observation as to how often prisoners died from sickness at Krang Tachan?
I did not know about that.
Mr. President, I'm about to change to a different subject if this is a convenient time.
President. Thank you, the Deputy Co-Prosecutor. It is time convenient for a lunch break. We will take a break now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon. And court officer, please assist the civil party during this lunch break, and invite him as well as Mr. Nyam Samnang, the RISU staff, back to the courtroom at 1:30 this afternoon. And as the chamber reminds you before, please draw the curtain before he leaves the courtroom and when he returns to the courtroom. This applies today and also tomorrow during this civil party's testimony. And security personnel, you are instructed to take Hill's pawn back to the waiting room downstairs and have him return to the courtroom this afternoon before 1:30. The court is now in recess.